Roughly 2,000 years ago, a debate broke out in the house of study. Rabbis Eliezer, Akiva, Joshua, and Gamliel were debating about a new type of oven. And the question before them was, if a portion of the oven became unclean, would that render the entire oven unkosher? Well, Rabbi Eliezer was an expert on the laws of kashrut, and so he presented his arguments. Every nuance, every possible point was made by Eliezer, but the rabbis didn't accept any of them. And so they voted, and it was 3-1, and Rabbi Eliezer lost. But Eliezer couldn't accept it, and so he said, if I'm right, may the carob tree that is outside of the house of study, may it get up, may it walk 100 cubits across the field, and then replant itself. And it, sure enough, the carob tree got up, it walked across the field, and replanted itself. And the three rabbis stood there in awe, and they consulted with each other as Rabbi Eliezer stood on one side of the study hall, and they said, what proof is there in a carob tree? We're talking about an oven. And so Rabbi Eliezer was dismayed. He couldn't believe it. And so he said, if I'm right, may the river that runs outside of this house of study, may it flow backwards. And sure enough, they looked outside, and the river was flowing backwards. And the three rabbis stood in the side of the study hall, and they looked over, and they saw Rabbi Eliezer standing on the other side of the hall, and they consulted, and they looked at him and said, what proof is there from the river flowing backwards? That has nothing to do with ovens. It's still 3-1, Rabbi Eliezer, you lose. And Rabbi Eliezer was appalled. He couldn't believe it. So he points his finger to the sky and says, if I'm right, may a voice from heaven declare who's right and who's wrong. And then all of a sudden, the study hall was filled with light, and the voice of God filled the study hall and said, why are you arguing with Rabbi Eliezer? Don't you know that in issues of kashrut, Rabbi Eliezer is always right? And the rabbis were shocked. They couldn't believe it. They're standing on their side of the study hall, and they look over at Rabbi Eliezer with a beam of light shining down on his face. And they consult for a moment, and they turn, and they say, okay, 3-2. I love that joke. Not only because it's 2,000 years old and comes from the Babylonian Talmud, and who said the ancient rabbis weren't funny, but because it shares a great truth about the nature of life. Sometimes you win, and sometimes you lose. And so when your clergy and staff were planning out themes for our high holidays, we settled on the theme of difficult conversations. Among the many difficult conversations I've been having lately with many of you, it reflects a concern about the elections. And for a rabbi on Rosh Hashana, in this political climate, this is dangerous territory. And there's been a great deal written lately about whether or not rabbis should be talking about these elections on the high holidays. And from what I understand, some will be talking about the politics of the day. And I tend to agree with these rabbis. Our synagogues are not places of escapism, and Judaism has something to say about the world in which we live. In fact, not addressing it would be an abandonment of our prophetic mission to engage with the world and work towards making it better. But other rabbis will ignore it entirely because they believe that at the high holidays it's more important to focus on inward spiritual issues. I also tend to agree with these rabbis, as the themes of the high holidays are timeless, and this election, like all things, will pass. So suffice it to say, I have struggled with what to share with you today. However, there is a deeply spiritual and deeply American lesson to be drawn from these high holidays. On Rosh Hashana, on Yom Kippur, and the days of awe in between, we are charged to bridge the personal and the communal, the ritual and ethical dimensions of life. We're charged to wrestle with our preconceived notions and shake ourselves from the slumber that exists when we choose to close our eyes to the worlds beyond our neighborhoods, our homes, or our inner worlds. In short, the high holidays teach us to challenge ourselves with different and difficult conversations. So from the outset, I want you to know that I will not be talking about either candidate this morning. Honestly, I don't think anything I would tell you about either of them would be particularly additive to the conversation. And my assessments would be no better than what you could read in newspapers or magazines, and some of you will vote for one, and some of you will vote for the other, and maybe some of you will vote for a third party, but all of you have a home here at Shalom. However, there is another, and I think more difficult conversation that we need to engage in, and it's this. On November 9th, there will be a winner, and on November 9th, there will be a loser. On November 9th, at least according to current polls, almost half of this country will have lost an election. But unlike the losing candidate who may recede into the background, these individuals who have lost, who have cast their vote, pinning their hopes on their candidate who didn't receive enough votes to win, will not be going anywhere. On November 9th, they will still be your neighbor, your colleague, your friend, or a member of your family. No one will be moving to Canada. I know it's fun to threaten, but trust me, it's not as easy as you think. We'll not be starting Congregation Shalom north of the border. And besides, there's a limit to how many of you I can sponsor for Canadian citizenship. So it's true that November 8th is an important day. As Americans, you will have the opportunity to perform the sacred responsibility of voting. And all the days leading up to November 8th are important too. But November 9th is more important. For November 9th and not November 8th is the day that speaks to the essence of what it is to be an American and to be a Jew. That is the day that presents the greatest test of who we are and how we proceed. And that is the day that I'm asking you to work more than any other to work towards, today and every day to come. So let's talk about how. Up to this point, we've borne witness to, and so many have engaged in, belittling and vilifying and stereotyping those of different political persuasions. Sadly, this has become part of the discourse leading to November 8th. Words like ignorant and elitist, selfish, racist, bigoted, crooked, corrupt have been tossed around. What is particularly troubling is that these names haven't been reserved for the candidates themselves. They've been used to describe their supporters, and that's particularly damaging. Sometimes these names have been earned, but for the vast majority, how could they be? Can almost half of this country be any of those things? When we call each other names, when we group entire segments of society together, we come to a very and ugly and potentially dangerous place. It will not lead to the November 9th that we all hope for. The distance between us, the distance between the left and the right, the supporters of one as opposed to another, is like a great chasm, so wide at times it feels as though we may be living in our own separate realities. As we draw further apart, this separation and estrangement threatens our community. But this distance can be traversed. In a powerful TED Talk, Julian Treasure spoke of sound and how we are losing our ability to listen in a louder world. He shared ways to retune our ears for conscious listening to other people in the world around us. In essence, what he says is that we live in a world where the loudest voices almost always seem to win. They garner attention. And yet these days there are so many loud voices, it becomes impossible to distinguish between the cacophonies that surround us. And worse, in order to escape, we're finding that there's a huge increase in individuals wearing headphones. Rather than engage with those around us, we are retreating into our own realities. We are both literally and metaphorically tuning out. There are echo chambers that we've created for ourselves where we listen to only the voices that we choose and we ignore the ones that we find challenging. And yet we can counteract that. In fact, when we think of the fundamental principle of our tradition, the central watchword of our faith, we find that we are commanded to Shema. This word, Shema, means to hear. It means to listen, to heed, and to pay attention. And perhaps most significant, Shema means to understand. Think for a moment of the power of the shofar. There are so many explanations for the use of the shofar, but perhaps the earliest is in itself profound. The shofar was most likely a signaling device. The blasts of the shofar sounded out across distances too difficult to cross. The intricate notes had meaning, and from across great expanses, there could be communication. And indeed, we're commanded not to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashana. Rather, we're commanded to hear the call of the shofar. We all stood here today with different points of view and different ideas about the world. There are members of our community who hold right-wing views, and there are members of our community who hold views to the left. All stood together and stood their inner selves. You could hear the silence of the room as we listened, heeded, and paid attention to the piercing call of the shofar. It isn't easy to listen. We are more often not filling the air with our own words. Too often we listen only to make a counterpoint or to argue or to criticize. It's not just in our political culture or our media culture. It permeates our homes, our workplaces, and our friendships. We are wounded creatures, we humans, and too often we respond as such, lashing out at perceived threats, subjugating others with our words or with our actions, and desiring more than anything else to win. But there is another way, a way that might allow for us all to achieve the unity needed in our homes, our workplaces, and most of all, the unity needed on November 9th. It begins with a force that can bring us together. And I know that it perhaps might sound glib or overly simplistic, but the Bible and the Beatles agree it's love. The commandment in Leviticus chapter 19 is straightforward and transcends religions. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am God. But what does this mean? Love thy neighbor as thyself. Is that even possible? Well, there's a beautiful Hasidic story by Rabbi Moshe Leib, who taught how one should love. He taught, I have learned how to love from a peasant. The peasant sat in an inn with some other peasant drinking. And a long time he was silent like the rest, but when his heart was moved by the wine, he spoke to his neighbor. Tell me, do you love me or don't you? And then the other peasant replied, I love you very much. But the first peasant answered, you say I love you, and yet you do not know what hurts me. If you loved me, in truth you would know. And the other man couldn't say a word, and the peasant who asked the first question fell back into silence. Rabbi Leib understood that to love people is to sense their wants and to bear their grief. Do we love our neighbor? Do we bear and understand our neighbor's wants and their grief? And there is so much grief in this world. Grief from both sides of the political aisle. There's grief in our homes and there's grief in our hearts. When we talk about the difficult conversations of the high holidays, the difficult conversations of life, we're not talking about a monologue. We all have much to bear, but today we are obligated to do so as a community, in dialogue with God, with ourselves, and with each other. But what keeps us from having the conversations necessary to move forward is our failure to listen and to understand. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks shared in a powerful sermon the importance of listening. He wrote, the very act of listening is a form of respect. The royal family in Britain is known always to arrive on time and to depart on time. And I'll never forget the occasion when the Queen stayed for 2 hours longer than her scheduled departure time. Her aides told me that they had never witnessed it before. The day was the 27th of January, 2005. The occasion, the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. The Queen had invited survivors to a reception at St. James Palace. Each had a story to tell, and the Queen took the time to listen to every one of them. One after another came up to me and said, 60 years ago I did not know whether tomorrow I would be alive, and here I am talking to the Queen. That act of listening was one of the most royal acts of graciousness I have ever witnessed. Listening is a profound affirmation of the humanity of the other. We must see the humanity in the other. We must listen. Listen to seek understanding, because we have so much in common, each and every one of us. And it bears out in studies. While polls are designed to establish differences between people, when researchers measure core values, they find that there is more in common than not between Americans of different political persuasions. Americans believe in a nation indivisible with liberty and justice for all. Americans believe in our common humanity. The rabbis of the first century held this view too. When asked why God created all humankind from just Adam, the answer was for peace among people so that one person won't say to his fellow, "My father is greater than your father." Not only did our ancestors see the image of God in each other and every person, they also had an appreciation for their uniqueness. They continued, "We're all created from Adam to tell of the greatness of God. For when a person mints many coins with one stamp, all of the resulting coins are the same as one another. However, when God minted every person with a stamp of Adam, not one of them is the same." How beautiful and how frightening to look into the face of our fellow and see our reflection staring back, knowing that we are all minted from the same stamp with common humanity, all the while knowing each of us is unique and precious. There's a postscript to that 2,000-year-old joke I told you at the beginning of the sermon. A little later in the Talmud, there's a story that one rabbi met Elijah the prophet, who had the inside scoop on how God reacted that day when God and Eliezer were outvoted. The rabbi asked, "What was God doing?" And the answer, "God was laughing with joy, saying, 'My children have defeated me. My children have defeated me.'" I wonder why the story teaches us that God was laughing with joy. After all, it's no small thing to defy the will of God. But I believe that despite the loss, despite being outvoted, perhaps God held a little pride in the uniqueness of those who outvoted him. There was no reprisal or anger. There was only recognition that they were all God's children, and they were all equally worthy of love. On November 8th, America will go to the polls. You'll pull a lever, fill in a card, or push a button, or whatever it is Americans do to vote. And in the privacy of that booth, you'll make a choice that reflects your uniqueness, and it's precious. You will leave the booth and you'll resume your lives as Americans. Your neighbor who made the same or different choice will still be your neighbor and will still share more values than differences. That is America at its best. God willing, that will be America on November 9th. There's a practice here at Congregation Shalom. Many of you do it at the conclusion of Kaddish, when we recite Oseh Shalom Bimromav. Well, this practice is very old. It comes from the Talmud, which states, "The one who prays must take 3 steps back, and only then pray for peace." Rabbi Menachem Ben Zion explains that we cannot pray for nor achieve peace if we are not willing to step back a little and make room for others and their opinions, their tastes, and personalities. And after stepping back, we ask, Oseh Shalom Bimromav, God, please bring peace. And we turn to the right and we turn to the left. Rabbi Ben Zion explains achieving peace and harmony means bowing towards those on the right of us and those on the left of us, not just straight ahead on our path. And so I'd like to ask for everyone here to rise together as we collectively recite Oseh Shalom and take 3 steps back and bow in all directions. Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom, Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru Amen. May the one who causes peace on high cause peace to descend on all of us, on all of Israel, and all of the world. And let us say, Amen. May the year 5777 be a year of listening and understanding. May the days ahead be ones of love and compassion. And may November 9th be a day of unity and peace. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May this be God's will. Please be seated.